Officer David Thompson stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his badge one final time before heading to work. 15 years on the force had taught him many things, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to discover that day at the 7th Precinct. The morning started like any other in the bustling city of Philadelphia. The summer heat was already creeping in as David pulled into the station's parking lot, nursing his usual cup of black coffee. His fellow officers greeted him with their typical morning nods as he made his way to his desk, but something felt different today. There was an unusual tension in the air. As he settled into his chair, David noticed a manila envelope sitting on his keyboard. No markings, no sender's name, just a plain envelope that someone had clearly placed there intentionally. His instincts, honed over years of detective work, told him this wasn't going to be an ordinary piece of mail. Inside, he found photographs and documents that made his coffee go cold. The images showed Captain Richard Harrison, his commanding officer of 5 years, meeting with known drug dealers in various locations across the city. But these weren't arrest scenarios, these were friendly conversations, handshakes, and what appeared to be exchanges of money. David's hands trembled slightly as he examined the documentation, bank statements showing suspicious deposits, text message transcripts, and detailed notes of meetings. The evidence suggested Captain Harrison had been taking bribes to protect certain drug operations in the city's south side for at least 3 years. His mind raced back to all the raids that had mysteriously been called off, the investigations that had hit unexpected dead ends, and the cases that had been reassigned without explanation. It all started making terrible sense. "Hey, Thompson," a voice called out, making him jump. It was Officer Chen, his partner of 2 years. "The captain wants to see everyone in the briefing room in 5 minutes. David quickly stuffed the envelope into his desk drawer, his heart pounding. As he walked to the briefing room, his thoughts were a storm of confusion and moral conflict. Captain Harrison had been his mentor, had written his recommendation for detective, had even attended his daughter's high school graduation. How could the same man be involved in something so corrupt? The briefing room filled up quickly with the morning shift officers. Captain Harrison stood at the front, his silver hair and pressed uniform projecting the same authority and confidence he'd always commanded. But now, David saw him through different eyes. "Good morning, everyone," Harrison began, his voice carrying its usual authoritative tone. "We've got some major operations planned for this week. First up, we're focusing on the rising drug activity in the North Side." David listened as Harrison detailed plans to crack down on drug operations in an area of the city that, according to the documents he'd just seen, wasn't part of the protected territory. It was a clever move, make arrests and seizures in one area while protecting illegal activities in another. The captain was maintaining his image while playing both sides. After the briefing, David returned to his desk, his mind working overtime. He had to make a decision. The evidence in his drawer could end Harrison's career and possibly send him to prison. But coming forward would mean more than just exposing his captain, it would mean challenging the entire power structure of the precinct. Harrison had friends in high places, both in the department and city hall. As David sat there, staring at his computer screen without really seeing it, he remembered something his father, also a cop, had told him when he first joined the force: "A badge isn't just a piece of metal, it's a promise to the people you serve. And sometimes keeping that promise means standing alone." The weight of that memory settled on his shoulders as he watched Captain Harrison walk past his desk, greeting officers with his characteristic smile and firm handshakes. The captain paused briefly at David's desk. "Everything all right, Thompson? You seem distracted this morning." David managed a convincing smile. "Just tired, sir. My daughter's college applications are keeping us all up late these days." Harrison chuckled knowingly. "That time already? Seems like yesterday she was starting high school." "Don't worry, it'll all work out." He patted David's shoulder and continued walking. That simple interaction made David's stomach turn. The captain's concern seemed so genuine, his demeanor so normal. How many other officers had he fooled over the years? How many good cops had unknowingly been part of his corrupt scheme? As the day progressed, David began carefully documenting everything he could remember about past cases that might have been compromised. He needed to build his own file, something solid that could support the evidence he'd received. But he had to be careful. One wrong move, one person noticing his unusual behavior, and everything could fall apart. By late afternoon, David had made his decision. He couldn't let this continue, couldn't be part of a system that betrayed everything he believed in. But he also knew he needed to be smart about how he proceeded. This wasn't just about exposing one corrupt officer, this was about protecting the integrity of the entire department and the community's trust in law enforcement. As he drove home that evening, the manila envelope secured in his laptop bag, David's mind was already mapping out his next steps. He would need allies, people he could trust absolutely. He would need to gather more evidence, build an airtight case. And most importantly, he would need to protect his family from the storm that was about to break. Looking at his reflection in the rearview mirror, David saw the same determined expression his father used to wear when facing a tough case. The road ahead would be difficult, possibly dangerous, but he knew there was only one right choice. The truth had found its way to his desk for a reason, and he wouldn't, turn his back on it. Little did David know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would test every principle he held dear, challenge every relationship he valued, and ultimately force him to decide what kind of officer, what kind of man, he truly wanted to be. The next morning, David arrived at the precinct an hour earlier than usual. The building was quiet, with only a few overnight shift officers finishing their paperwork. He needed this solitude to think clearly about his next move. The weight of the manila envelope, now stored securely in his home safe, seemed to follow him everywhere. As he sipped his coffee in the empty break room, Officer Chen walked in, looking surprised to see him there so early. David had known Chen since she joined the force 3 years ago, and something about her unwavering integrity made him wonder if she could be trusted with what he knew. "You're here early," Chen said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Everything okay?" David hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Can we talk somewhere private?" They found themselves in the empty evidence room, where David carefully began to share what he'd discovered. Chen's expression shifted from confusion to shock, and finally to a controlled anger that reflected his own feelings. "I had my suspicions about some of those failed raids," she whispered, "but this is bigger than I imagined." "What are you planning to do?" "I need to gather more evidence," David replied. "The package I received is a good start, but we need more. Recent cases, specific dates, names. Something that can't be explained away." Chen nodded slowly. "I can help. I've been keeping my own notes about suspicious case closures. Nothing concrete, just things that didn't add up. Never thought it went this high up though." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. They quickly separated, pretending to search through evidence boxes as Officer Rodriguez walked in, giving them a curious look before grabbing what he needed and leaving. Throughout the day, David noticed small things he'd missed before. The way certain officers always seemed to know which areas to avoid during patrols. The regular meetings between Captain Harrison and Detective Wilson, always behind closed doors, always off the books. During lunch, David received a text from an unknown number, "Parking garage. Level 3. 2 p.m. His instincts told him this was connected to the envelope, but experience warned him it could also be a trap. He decided to take precautions. He asked Chen to monitor the security cameras from the dispatch desk, and he wore a personal recording device he'd bought years ago but rarely used. As he walked to the parking garage, his hand stayed close to his weapon. Level 3 was dimly lit and nearly empty. A figure stood in the shadows near the back wall, a man David recognized as James Cooper, a retired internal affairs investigator who'd left the force 2 years ago under mysterious circumstances. "Officer Thompson," Cooper said quietly as David approached. "I see you got my package. You sent the evidence?" David asked, maintaining a safe distance. "Why me?" Cooper stepped slightly forward, his face half illuminated by the fluorescent lights. "Because you're one of the few cops I've watched who never took shortcuts, never looked the other way. And because Harrison trusts you, which means you can get closer than I ever could. Why didn't you pursue this when you were with IA?" "I tried," Cooper's voice carried years of frustration. "Every time I got close, the evidence disappeared, witnesses changed their stories, or cases were suddenly classified as resolved. Harrison has friends in every department, including IA. That's why I had to leave. They were about to pin a false misconduct charge on me." David absorbed this information, his mind racing with implications. "The evidence you sent, how did you get it?" "I never stopped investigating," Cooper replied. "Even after I left. I've spent 2 years building this case, but I can't do anything with it officially." "You can. But be careful, Harrison's network is extensive, and they play dirty." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car engine. Cooper quickly handed David a burner phone. "Everything I have is backed up on this. Trust no one in the department except Officer Chen, I've vetted her too. And Thompson, watch your back." As Cooper disappeared into the shadows, David's phone buzzed with a message from Chen, "Captain asking for you. Urgent." David's heart rate increased as he made his way back to the precinct. Had someone seen him with Cooper? Was his investigation already compromised? He took a moment to compose himself before entering Harrison's office. The captain was on the phone when David walked in, but he quickly ended the call. "Thompson, take a seat." Harrison's voice was friendly, but there was something else in his tone that David couldn't quite read. "I've got a special assignment for you," Harrison continued. "We've received intelligence about a major drug shipment coming in through the South Side docks next week. I want you to lead the operation." David kept his expression neutral, but his mind was racing. The South Side docks, exactly where the evidence showed Harrison's protected operations were based. This wasn't an assignment, it was a test. "It's a big responsibility," Harrison added, watching David carefully. "But you've earned it. Just remember, operations like this require discretion. Some things might not be exactly by the book, but it's all for the greater good." "I understand, sir," David replied, maintaining eye contact. "Thank you for the opportunity." As he left the office, David felt the walls closing in. Harrison was either trying to bring him into the corrupt operation or setting him up for a fall. Either way, he was running out of time. That evening, David sat in his car outside the precinct, reviewing everything on Cooper's phone. The evidence was substantial: financial records, surveillance photos, witness statements, and even recorded conversations. But bringing this to light would mean more than just exposing Harrison, it would reveal corruption at multiple levels of the department. As he drove home, David noticed a black SUV following him. He took several random turns to confirm his suspicion. The SUV stayed with him, maintaining a consistent distance. Someone was watching him, which meant they already suspected something. He pulled into a busy shopping center parking lot, weaving between cars until he found an exit on the opposite side. The SUV lost him in the traffic, but David knew this was just the beginning. They would be watching his house, his family, his every move. Arriving home, he hugged his daughter tighter than usual, earning a confused look from her. His wife noticed his tension during dinner but waited until they were alone to ask what was wrong. "I might have to send you and Lisa to your sisters for a while," he said quietly, knowing he couldn't tell her everything yet. Not until he had a plan to keep them safe. "David, what's going on?" The concern in her voice made his heart ache. "Trust me," he replied, squeezing her hand. Just for a little while. Please. That night, as his family slept, David sat in his home office, carefully documenting everything that had happened. He encrypted Cooper's files and stored them in multiple secure locations. If something happened to him, the truth would still come out. Tomorrow, he would have to start playing Harrison's game while secretly building his case. One wrong move could cost him everything: his career, his family's safety, maybe even his life. But as he looked at the family photos on his desk, he knew he had no choice. The truth had chosen him as its messenger, and he would see it through, no matter the cost. The following days felt like walking through a minefield for David. Every conversation, every phone call, every email could be monitored. He maintained his usual routine while secretly gathering evidence, knowing that one misstep could bring everything crashing down. His wife and daughter had reluctantly agreed to visit his sister-in-law in Pittsburgh, under the pretense of helping with wedding preparations. As he watched them drive away, David felt both relief and loneliness wash over him. At least they would be safe from whatever was coming. At the precinct, David threw himself into planning the South Side Docks operation. He needed to appear completely committed while figuring out how to expose Harrison's true intentions. Officer Chen helped by discreetly monitoring communication channels and keeping track of who visited the captain's office. "Something big is happening," Chen whispered during their coffee break. "Detective Wilson's been making calls to numbers that don't show up in any official records. And there's been unusual activity at the docks, vehicles coming and going at odd hours." David nodded slightly, keeping his voice low. "Harrison's setting up something parallel to our operation. We need to figure out what it is without tipping our hand." Their conversation was interrupted by Detective Wilson himself, who approached with his usual swagger. "Thompson, got a minute? Need to go over some details for next week." In Wilson's office, David noticed something he hadn't before: a small silver anchor pin on the detective's lapel, identical to one he'd seen in Cooper's surveillance photos of the drug dealers meeting with Harrison. "Captain wants this operation to go smoothly," Wilson said, spreading out a map of the docks. "We've got solid intel about which warehouses to hit. These 3 are our primary targets." He circled several buildings on the map. David studied the locations, recognizing them from Cooper's files as legitimate businesses. The real drug operations were happening in different warehouses entirely. This was their play: use him to raid innocent businesses while the actual criminals moved their product freely. "What about these warehouses?" David asked casually, pointing to the actual suspicious locations. "Shouldn't we cover all potential routes?" Wilson's expression flickered for just a moment. "No need. Our intel is solid on the primary targets. Don't want to spread our resources too thin." That evening, David met Cooper in a different parking garage, sharing what he'd learned. The retired investigator listened intently, taking notes. "The anchor pins are their identification system," Cooper explained. "Different colors for different ranks in the operation. Silver means they're directly connected to the distribution network." "They're using my raid as cover," David said. "While we're hitting empty warehouses, they'll be moving their real shipment." Cooper nodded grimly. "And if anything goes wrong, you'll be the fall guy. A decorated officer gone rogue, trying to protect drug dealers. They've probably already planted evidence to support that story if needed." David felt a chill run down his spine. "We need to move faster. But if we show our hand too soon, they'll bury everything," Cooper finished. "And probably us along with it." As they discussed options, David's burner phone buzzed with a message from Chen, 911. "Office compromised. Meet at usual spot." David found Chen at their backup meeting location, a busy coffee shop several blocks from the precinct. Her hands shook slightly as she sipped her coffee. "Someone went through your desk after hours," she said quietly. Professional job, everything was put back exactly in place. But they left this. She slid a photo across the table. David's heart nearly stopped. It showed his wife and daughter at his sister-in-law's house in Pittsburgh. They were being watched, even there. "There's more," Chen continued. "I overheard Wilson talking about contingency plans if the dock operation goes wrong. They're not just planning to frame you, they're going to make you disappear." David's mind raced. They needed to move now, but they had to be smart about it. One wrong move and his family would pay the price. "We need leverage," he said finally. "Something so big that they can't risk touching us." "I might have something," Chen replied. "Remember those backdated case files I mentioned? I found a pattern. The corruption goes beyond drugs. They've been protecting a human trafficking ring too." David felt sick. The depth of the corruption was worse than he'd imagined. But this could be their opening. Human trafficking cases attracted federal attention. If they could document the connection. Over the next 2 days, David played his role perfectly while secretly building their case. He attended planning meetings, reviewed operational details, and maintained his usual friendly relationship with Harrison. All while Chen worked with Cooper to compile evidence about the trafficking connection. The pressure was becoming unbearable. David barely slept, jumping at every sound in his empty house. He called his family daily, trying to sound normal while knowing they were being watched. Each morning, he wondered if this would be the day Harrison's people made their move. 3 days before the planned raid, David received an unexpected visitor at his home, Officer Rodriguez, one of the youngest cops in the precinct. "I know what you're doing," Rodriguez said without preamble when David opened the door. "And I want to help." David tensed, ready for a trap, but Rodriguez quickly continued. "My brother was killed 3 years ago. They said it was a drug deal gone bad, but he was clean. He was going to testify about corrupt cops in his precinct. I've been watching, waiting for a chance to expose the truth." After carefully vetting Rodriguez's story, David had another ally. More importantly, he had a direct connection to previous victims of the corruption. Rodriguez's brother's death was part of a pattern they could prove. The pieces were finally coming together, but time was running out. Harrison's operation at the docks was scheduled for Friday night. David knew that whatever they were going to do, it had to happen before then. That night, as he reviewed their evidence one final time, David received a text from an unknown number: "Tomorrow. 9 a.m. Your family or your badge." They were done waiting. Harrison was making his move. David sat in his living room, surrounded by case files and evidence, and made the hardest phone call of his life. It was time to reach out to the one person who might be able to help, his father's old partner, now a high-ranking official in the FBI. As the phone rang, David looked at a photo of himself and his father at his police academy graduation. "A badge isn't just a piece of metal," his father had said. Now, years later, David understood exactly what he meant. The next 12 hours would determine everything: his family's safety, his career, and the future of the department he had sworn to serve. But for the first time since this began, David felt ready. They had the evidence, they had a plan, and most importantly, they had the truth on their side. What he didn't know was that Captain Harrison had one more card to play, one that would test David's resolve in ways he never imagined possible. At exactly 9 a.m., David sat in Captain Harrison's office, his expression carefully neutral. The morning sun cast long shadows across the room, and the usual sounds of the precinct seemed muffled, distant. "I've always liked you, Thompson," Harrison began, leaning back in his chair. "You remind me of myself when I was younger. Idealistic. Determined. But sometimes we need to adapt to reality." "What kind of reality are we talking about, sir?" David asked, his hand discreetly activating the recording device in his pocket. Harrison smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I know about your investigation. Cooper reached out to you, didn't he? That old fool never could let things go. He pushed a folder across the desk. Take a look. Inside were photos, dozens of them. His wife and daughter at various locations in Pittsburgh, his sister-in-law's house, even inside local stores. The message was clear. Here's reality, Harrison continued. You have a choice to make. Option 1, you join us. The department has always operated with certain arrangements. It keeps the peace, keeps everyone happy. You'd be well compensated, and your family stays safe. David's jaw tightened. And option 2? Don't make me spell it out, Harrison replied softly. You're a smart man. Think about your daughter's future. Before David could respond, Officer Rodriguez burst into the office. Captain. We've got a situation at the docks. One of our surveillance teams just spotted armed men entering Warehouse 7. Harrison's eyes narrowed slightly. This wasn't part of the plan. Warehouse 7 was one of their protected locations. Thompson, take a team and check it out, Harrison ordered. But remember our conversation. As David left the office, his mind was racing. This was an unexpected complication, but it might also be an opportunity. He quickly texted Chen and Cooper using their agreed-upon code. The game has changed. Plan B. At the docks, David found a scene of controlled chaos. Several unmarked vehicles were parked outside Warehouse 7, and there were clear signs of an ongoing operation. But something felt off. Rodriguez, what exactly did your team see? David asked as they geared up. 4 armed men entered through the side door, Rodriguez replied. They looked professional. Military-style movements. David's suspicion grew. This was too convenient, too perfectly timed. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd been saving. Agent Roberts? It's David Thompson. Remember that favor you owed my father? I need to know if you have any operations running at the Philadelphia docks today. The FBI agent's response confirmed his fears. They had no active operations in the area. David gathered his team, carefully selected officers he'd vetted over the past few days. Listen up. This is likely a setup. They're expecting us to go in blind, probably into an ambush. But we're going to flip their script. He outlined his plan quickly. Chen would coordinate from the surveillance van, monitoring all communications. Rodriguez and his team would cover the exits. David would lead the main entry team, but not before putting their own surveillance in place. As they moved into position, David received a text from Cooper, files delivered to FBI and 3 major news outlets. Dead man's switch active. You're covered. David allowed himself a small smile. Even if something went wrong here, the truth would come out. His family would be protected by the exposure. The raid began precisely at 10:17 a.m. But instead of rushing in through the main entrance as expected, David's team deployed smoke grenades at all exits simultaneously. The confusion allowed them to identify the hidden observation posts, including one where Detective Wilson was stationed with a high-powered rifle. Philadelphia PD. Drop your weapons. David's voice boomed through his megaphone. The building is surrounded, and this operation is being monitored by federal authorities. The next few minutes were tense but controlled. As the smoke cleared, they found not the ambush they'd expected, but evidence, mountains of it. The armed men Rodriguez had reported were actually Harrison's own people, hurriedly trying to clear out incriminating documents and hard drives. David's team secured the scene methodically, documenting everything. Among the discoveries were ledgers detailing years of payoffs, protected shipment schedules, and most damning of all, a list of compromised officers in 3 different precincts. Back at the station, Harrison was already gone when they returned, but he hadn't gotten far. FBI agents, coordinating with David's father's old partner, had been waiting. The captain was arrested at the airport, his go bag containing over $200,000 in cash and multiple fake passports. But the day wasn't over. As David supervised the processing of evidence from the warehouse, Officer Chen rushed in. "They're moving on your family," she said breathlessly. "Wilson wasn't at the warehouse raid. He's gone to Pittsburgh." David's blood ran cold. He immediately called his wife, but there was no answer. His hands shook as he dialed Agent Roberts. "Already on it," the agent assured him. "We have a team in Pittsburgh. They've been watching your family since you called this morning. Your wife and daughter are safe, already in protective custody. Wilson walked right into our surveillance." The relief nearly brought David to his knees. After hanging up, he sat heavily in his chair, the events of the day finally catching up to him. Rodriguez brought him a cup of coffee. "You okay, sir?" David nodded slowly. "It's not over yet. Harrison's network is extensive. There will be pushback, investigations, probably threats. But the truth is out now," Chen added, joining them. "Cooper's files have already hit the news. 3 other officers have come forward with additional evidence. The dam has broken." Looking around the precinct, David could see the impact already beginning. Some officers were clearing out their desks, knowing they'd be implicated. Others were huddled in small groups, processing the revelations. A few approached David, offering their support and sharing their own suspicions and experiences. As the day drew to a close, David received one final text from Cooper: "Your father would be proud." He sat in his car for a long moment before heading home, reflecting on the cost of truth, and its value. His career would never be the same. Some would call him a hero, others a traitor. The road ahead would be difficult, full of investigations, testimonies, and probably some form of retaliation. But as he drove to the FBI safe house where his family waited, David felt a peace he hadn't experienced in weeks. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, he could look in the mirror and see what his father had always seen: a man who kept his promise to serve and protect, no matter the cost. What he didn't realize was that this was just the first wave of a much larger storm. Harrison's network extended far beyond the police department, and some very powerful people were about to have their comfortable worlds disrupted. The real fight was just beginning. The next few weeks unfolded like a complex chess game. David's family remained under FBI protection while the investigation expanded, revealing layers of corruption that shocked even the most cynical observers. Each day brought new revelations, and with them, new dangers. Sitting in a secure conference room at the FBI field office, David reviewed the growing evidence wall with Agent Roberts. Red strings connected photos, documents, and transcripts, painting a picture far larger than one corrupt police captain. Harrison was just a middle manager, Roberts explained, pointing to new financial records. "We've traced payments through shell companies leading to some of the city's most prominent figures. Business leaders, politicians, even judges." David leaned forward, studying a particular document. "These shipping manifests, they're all tied to the Central Harbor Development Project?" Roberts nodded grimly. "A $5 billion waterfront renovation project. Perfect cover for moving illegal goods and laundering money. The construction sites, the constant traffic, the legitimate business dealings all mixing with the illegal ones. And Harrison's protection racket was just one piece of it," David added, the scope of the corruption becoming clear. No wonder they were willing to kill to keep it quiet. Their discussion was interrupted by Chen, who rushed in with her laptop. "You need to see this. Someone leaked your personnel file to the press. They're trying to discredit you." The morning news was running a hit piece questioning David's past cases, suggesting he had personal vendettas against his fellow officers. They'd dug up an old internal affairs complaint, one that had been dismissed years ago, and were spinning it into a narrative of an angry, untrustworthy cop. "They're following the playbook," Roberts said. "Discredit the whistleblower, muddy the waters. But we expected this. Your clean record and Cooper's evidence dumps are making it hard for them to make anything stick." David's phone buzzed, a text from Rodriguez, Channel 8 News crew outside the precinct. "They're interviewing officers about you." Watching the live feed, David saw several officers he'd worked with for years telling the cameras he was difficult to work with and always had a chip on his shoulder. The betrayal stung, but it wasn't surprising. Fear made people choose sides quickly. "Let them talk," David said finally. "The evidence speaks louder than their lies." Later that day, David visited Harrison in federal custody. The former captain looked smaller in his orange jumpsuit, his silver hair disheveled, but his eyes still held their calculating gleam. "Come to gloat?" Harrison asked as David sat across from him. "Come to offer you a deal," David replied. "The FBI is willing to consider a reduced sentence if you help expose the entire network. You know this goes beyond the department." Harrison laughed softly. "You still don't get it, do you? You think you've won because you caught me? I'm replaceable. The system isn't about individuals, it's about power and money. Cut off one head, two more grow back." "Maybe," David acknowledged. "But we'll keep cutting until there's nothing left to grow back." As he left the detention center, David received an unexpected call from the police commissioner's office. The commissioner wanted a private meeting, off the record, no FBI involvement. David consulted with Roberts, who advised against it, but something in David's gut told him this was important. They set up surveillance and a backup team, and the next morning, David walked into the commissioner's private office. Commissioner Banks, a tall man with 35 years on the force, stood looking out his window. "Officer Thompson, thank you for coming. What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room." He turned, his expression grave. 20 years ago, I was like you, young, idealistic, determined to clean up the department. I had evidence of corruption reaching into City Hall. But when I tried to expose it..." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing an old bullet scar. "They killed my partner and made it look like a robbery gone wrong." The message was clear. "Why are you telling me this?" David asked. "Because you've already gone further than I ever did. You've cracked the foundation of something that's been growing for decades. But you need to understand, these people, they don't just have money and influence. They have patience. They'll wait years to get their revenge." The commissioner walked to his desk and retrieved a thick envelope. "This is everything I've collected over the years. Names, dates, connections I could never prove. Maybe you can use it. But be careful, trust no one completely, not even me." As David left the office, his mind was racing with the implications. The commissioner's warning felt less like a threat and more like a prophecy. This wasn't going to end with arrests and trials. The corruption had roots too deep to pull out all at once. That evening, as he reviewed the commissioner's files in a safe house, Chen brought more news. "They're starting to move against the officers who supported you. Transfer orders, schedule changes, partner reassignments. They're isolating anyone who spoke up." David had expected this, but hearing it still made his blood boil. These were good cops being punished for doing the right thing. "We need to protect our own," he said firmly. "Get me a list of everyone who's being targeted. We'll make sure their stories get to the right people." Rodriguez joined them later, bringing takeout and updates from the precinct. The mood's shifting. More officers are starting to talk, especially the younger ones. "Your stand is inspiring people. Or making them nervous," Chen added. "Word is the FBI's expanding their investigation to 2 other precincts." David spread out the commissioner's files on the table. "This goes beyond precincts. Look at these construction permits, these zoning changes. Every major development project in the city for the past decade has been touched by this network. As they pieced together the connections, David's phone lit up with a news alert. A prominent real estate developer linked to the harbor project had been found dead in his office, an apparent suicide. But David had seen his name in the commissioner's files, connected to multiple suspicious land deals. They're cleaning house, he realized. Trying to bury their tracks before we can follow them. The implications were clear: the network was vast, powerful, and willing to sacrifice its own to maintain control. David and his allies had struck a significant blow, but they'd also stirred up a hornet's nest. Looking at Chen and Rodriguez, David saw the same determination in their eyes that he felt. They were in too deep to back out now, and the truth needed champions who wouldn't be silenced. "Tomorrow," he said, "we take this public. All of it. No more shadows, no more secrets. Let them try to bury the truth when it's staring everyone in the face." What they didn't know was that across town, in an expensive high-rise office, a group of powerful figures were meeting to discuss exactly that possibility, and their plans to ensure it never happened. The morning dawned gray and humid, matching the tension in the air. David stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for what would be the most important press conference of his career. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since 5 a.m., reporters, fellow officers, and even anonymous numbers trying to reach him. "Are you sure about this?" his wife asked from the doorway of their new safe house. She'd always supported his decisions, but he could hear the worry in her voice. "We can't hide in the shadows anymore," David replied, turning to face her. "They're counting on our fear to keep us quiet." The plan was set. At 10 a.m., David would hold a press conference outside City Hall, accompanied by Chen, Rodriguez, and several other officers who'd agreed to come forward. Cooper had prepared comprehensive evidence packets for every major news outlet, and the FBI was standing by to make simultaneous arrests across the city. But as David drove downtown, he noticed something odd. The usual morning traffic was unusually light, and several key intersections were blocked by construction crews that hadn't been there the day before. "Something's wrong," he said into his phone, connecting with Chen. "They're trying to control access to City Hall." "It's worse than that," Chen replied urgently. "The construction companies, they're all subsidiaries of Harbor Development. They're boxing us in." David made a quick decision, turning his car around. "Tell everyone to switch to backup location B. And Chen, watch your back." The backup location was the steps of the old courthouse, a symbolic choice that wouldn't be lost on anyone. As David arrived, he saw news vans already setting up, and a crowd beginning to gather. Rodriguez was coordinating with uniformed officers to secure the perimeter. "FBI just called," Rodriguez reported as David approached. "They've arrested 3 judges and 2 city council members so far. But some of their primary targets are missing, they must have been tipped off." David nodded grimly. "Doesn't matter. Once this goes public, they'll have nowhere to hide." As the crowd grew larger, David noticed familiar faces in strategic positions, officers he knew were loyal to the old system, watching and waiting. But he also saw something else: young officers, community members, and even some local business owners coming to show support. At 10:15 a.m., David stepped up to the microphones. Camera lights flashed as he began to speak, his voice steady and clear. 15 years ago, I took an oath to protect and serve. That oath wasn't just to the department, it was to every citizen of this city. Today, I stand before you to expose a truth that has been hidden for far too long." As David began detailing the evidence of corruption, something unexpected happened. More police officers began arriving, not to stop him, but to stand with him. They came in ones and twos, then in groups, forming a symbolic wall behind him. "The corruption we've uncovered isn't just about dirty cops or bribes," David continued. "It's about a system that has betrayed the trust of every citizen. The Harbor Development Project, which promised to revitalize our waterfront, has been a front for money laundering and criminal enterprise. But more than that, it represents decades of corruption that has infected every level of city government. He held up a thick folder. In these documents, you'll find evidence of judicial bribes, fraudulent contracts, and systematic corruption that has cost this city billions of dollars. But the real cost can't be measured in money. It's measured in lost trust, in communities torn apart, in good officers forced to choose between their conscience and their careers. Suddenly, Chen's voice crackled over his earpiece. "David, we've got movement. Multiple SUVs approaching from the north. Private security, heavily armed." David didn't miss a beat. To those who think they can still control this narrative through intimidation, you're too late. The evidence is already out there. Copies have been sent to federal authorities, news outlets, and anti-corruption organizations across the country. The SUVs pulled up at the periphery of the crowd, but their intended show of force backfired. Community members closed ranks, forming a human barrier. Local business owners who'd suffered under the corrupt system stood their ground. The private security forces found themselves facing not just a group of whistleblower cops, but an entire community that had had enough. "This isn't just about exposing corruption," David continued, his voice growing stronger. "It's about reclaiming our city. Every officer who turns a blind eye, every official who takes a bribe, every developer who uses their influence to crush competition, they're not just breaking the law, they're breaking a sacred trust." As he spoke, breaking news alerts began flashing across phones in the crowd. The FBI's simultaneous raids were making headlines. Photos of prominent figures being led away in handcuffs appeared on news websites. The network was crumbling in real time. But David knew this was just the beginning. The corrupt system wouldn't go down without a fight. Already, he could see their counter-strategy forming: leaked documents attempting to smear witnesses, sudden, technical issues affecting news coverage, and mysterious pressure being applied to advertisers and media outlets. After the press conference, David met with his core team in a secure location. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by the sobering reality of what came next. "They'll try to bury this," Cooper warned, joining them via secure video link. "They still have judges in their pocket, media connections, political influence." "Let them try," Chen replied firmly. "The truth is like water, the more they try to contain it, the more ways it finds to break free." Rodriguez brought up a concerning development on his laptop. "They're already spinning this as a racial issue, trying to divide the department and the community. Claiming you're targeting specific officers and officials based on prejudice." David had expected this tactic. "That's why we need to stay focused on the evidence. This isn't about individuals or demographics, it's about a corrupt system that's hurt everyone in this city." As they discussed next steps, David received an unexpected message from Commissioner Banks: "Meeting now. Urgent. Come alone." The team advised against it, but David knew he had to go. The commissioner's office was dark when he arrived, lit only by a desk lamp. "You've started something that can't be stopped," Banks said without preamble. "But you need to understand what's coming. They're going to throw everything they have at you, not just professional attacks, but personal ones. They'll go after your family, your history, your reputation." "I know," David replied calmly. "But we've got something they don't, the truth." Banks smiled sadly. "Truth is a powerful weapon, Thompson. But remember, in this kind of war, there are no real winners. Just survivors and casualties." As David left the commissioner's office, he thought about those words. The old system was wounded, but wounded animals are often the most dangerous. The next few days would determine whether their exposure of corruption would lead to real change or simply a restructuring of power. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife: "News is saying they're trying to suspend you. Coming after your pension and benefits." David typed back a simple response: "Worth it for the truth." But as he drove home through the darkening city streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that the biggest battles, and the highest costs, still lay ahead. The aftermath of the press conference unleashed a storm that shook the city to its core. Within days, David found himself at the center of a nationwide media frenzy. While some hailed him as a hero, others painted him as a traitor to the badge. The pressure was intense, but the evidence they'd gathered was speaking louder than any attempted smear campaign. Sitting in a crowded hearing room at City Hall, David watched as former Captain Harrison took the stand. The Congressional Oversight Committee had convened an emergency session to investigate the scope of corruption in the city's institutions. Officer Thompson's allegations are nothing but the desperate actions of a disgruntled employee, Harrison declared, his voice steady but his hands betraying a slight tremor. These so-called evidence packets are carefully crafted misrepresentations of legitimate police work. David remained silent, knowing their moment was coming. Chen sat beside him, quietly updating their digital evidence file on her tablet. They had prepared for this. The committee chairwoman, Representative Torres, leaned forward. "Captain Harrison, could you explain these bank transfers?" She held up a document. "According to federal investigators, over $20 million moved through accounts connected to you in the past 5 years. Harrison's composure cracked slightly. "Those funds were part of legitimate business investments. My family has various interests outside of my police work." "Interesting," Torres replied. "Because we have testimony from 3 different developers about how those investments worked. Would you like to hear it?" As Harrison's testimony unraveled, David received an urgent text from Rodriguez, "Emergency at the precinct. Multiple officers being served with warrants. They're saying you planted evidence." David showed the message to Chen. They had anticipated this move, a last-ditch effort to discredit the investigation by claiming evidence tampering. But they had prepared for it. "Go," Chen whispered. "I'll handle things here." At the precinct, David found chaos. Internal affairs investigators were conducting searches while shocked officers watched. Detective Wilson, who had managed to avoid the initial wave of arrests, was leading the charge against David's supporters. "Thompson," Wilson called out, his voice carrying across the room. "IA has some questions about your evidence handling. Seems like some of those files you provided might have been altered." David stepped forward, maintaining his calm. "Interesting timing, Detective. But I think you'll find every piece of evidence has been independently verified. Including the recordings from your own body cam." Wilson's smile faltered. He hadn't known about the backup copies Cooper had secured from the department's cloud storage, unaltered footage that showed Wilson's involvement in the corruption. "All officers being investigated have the right to union representation," David announced to the room. "And anyone being pressured to make false statements should know that federal whistleblower protections are in place." As he spoke, FBI agents entered the precinct, led by Agent Roberts. They had been waiting for this moment. The attempted counterattack would only provide more evidence of obstruction. David's phone lit up with a news alert. The developer who had been found dead, the supposed suicide, had left a detailed confession with his lawyer. If anything happened to him, the letter was to be released. It named names, detailed schemes, and provided account numbers. The entire corrupt network was beginning to implode. Back at City Hall, Chen was orchestrating their response to Harrison's testimony. She presented evidence of how the harbor development project had been used to facilitate both drug trafficking and money laundering. Security camera footage, financial records, and testimony from former gang members painted a damning picture. "The question isn't just about corrupt officers," Chen testified. "It's about how an entire system was corrupted. Construction permits were fast-tracked for certain companies while legitimate businesses were delayed. Drug shipments moved freely through secured areas. Money disappeared from city budgets while certain officials bought vacation homes. The hearing room fell silent as she played audio recordings of meetings between Harrison and various city officials. The conversations were explicit, discussions of payoffs, cover-ups, and retribution against anyone who tried to expose the truth. David returned just as Chen finished her testimony. The mood in the room had shifted dramatically. Even those who had been skeptical were now confronted with undeniable evidence of systemic corruption. But victory came with a price. That evening, David received a call from his wife. Their daughter's college acceptance had been mysteriously rescinded. The corrupt network was still fighting, targeting families and futures. "They're trying to break us by breaking our families," David told his team as they gathered in their secure meeting room. "But they don't understand, this was always about protecting our families, about leaving a better city for our children." Cooper joined them via video call, his face grave. "We've identified the main players trying to maintain the network. High-level businessmen, politicians, even a federal judge. They're planning something big, a coordinated effort to discredit everything we've exposed." "Let them try," Rodriguez said firmly. "The truth is already out there. Every attempt they make to cover it up just proves how deep the corruption goes." As they discussed strategy, Commissioner Banks arrived unexpectedly. He looked tired but determined. "They offered me a deal," he announced. "My silence in exchange for a comfortable retirement and guaranteed protection for my family." He paused, looking around the room. "I told them to shove it. I'm done being afraid." The commissioner's stand was significant. As one of the highest-ranking officials in the department, his full cooperation would help expose corruption at levels they hadn't yet reached. But even as they gained ground, David knew the fight was far from over. The corrupt system had spent decades entrenching itself in every aspect of city governance. Dismantling it would require more than just exposing evidence, it would require rebuilding institutions from the ground up. "We need to think bigger," David told his team. "This isn't just about prosecuting corrupt officials. It's about changing the system that allowed corruption to flourish." They began outlining a comprehensive reform plan, new oversight mechanisms, transparent budgeting processes, community involvement in police operations. It was ambitious, perhaps idealistic, but necessary. As the night wore on, David stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The city skyline stretched before him, lights twinkling in the darkness. Somewhere out there, powerful people were plotting to maintain their corrupt empire. But something had changed, the wall of silence had cracked, and through that crack, hope was flooding in. His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number: "Tomorrow, noon. Parking garage where this all began. Come alone. You need to see this." David stared at the message, knowing it could be a trap. But he also knew that in this fight, the biggest risks often led to the most important breakthroughs. The question was, how much more was he willing to risk to see this through to the end?